Yeah, welcome everyone to the second session of the 2020 post-harvest debrief from Quorum Sense. We had Nigel Greenwood last week, and I think most people attending tonight were on that, and I'm just about to upload it to YouTube if you missed it, so we'll have it up there shortly, as with this one once we're done. And on which note, if anyone is wanting to ask questions and that kind of stuff and they're not happy for that to be on YouTube, just let me know and I can edit it out before we upload it. Bit of a disclaimer there. And yeah, so tonight we've got Dave Birkett as our second kind of guest feature, and we've got about 40 minutes of pre-recording that we did when we recorded Nigel and Dave at the same time a couple of weeks ago. I've also cut in some footage of Dave out in the paddock that we recorded as well, so the video will cut through to that at one point. Hopefully it's not too chaotic in terms of cutting between things. With that in mind, I'll share my screen and we will get this presentation going, and I'll pump the volume up because last time that seemed to be a bit of an issue, and it'll blow my eardrum if I don't take my headphone out beforehand. So here we go, 40 minutes, sit back and enjoy.
My name's David Birkett. We've been farming in a system for about 20-25 years of looking after our soil, incorporating all our residues and so forth. We're not a completely no-till system, we're a hybrid system, so we do as much minimum tillage as we can and direct drill when we can. And we haven't done any inversion now for probably 5 years. And even in the previous 15 years, it was probably only 1 or 2 paddocks a year to get us out of a problem situation. Normally was the plough. But so yeah, we've been putting those residues in for 25 years now. But the big change for me has been the last 3 years of actual planned cover crops. So prior to that, we grew cover crops, but they were essentially accidental cover crops. So we'd incorporate our residues, and whatever volunteers came up, as long as a few other weeds, they were grazed through the winter and effectively were acting as a cover crop. But we weren't sort of targeting the right species that was going in there. So since we have been doing targeted cover crops into those situations, the soil was just gone to another level, really. It was always already in a reasonably good condition, but those actual cover crops have made a hell of a difference to the state of our soil and the robustness of it. So we're a full arable system with livestock in our system. We just trade lambs during the winter, so the stock are all off. But I do think that the stock in the system are a pretty key component. Nigel's been talking about, we talked about the grazing option of cover crops prior to drilling, and I think it does help speed up the breakdown process of those cover crops, and also the activation of the minerals, of the nutrients in those cover crops as well. I think we generally don't see any in being tied up in our system, and I think that's partly because we do graze about half of it and return about half of it. Today I wanted to talk about two trials we did this year. One was on hybrid radish and the other one was on a winter wheat crop. I'll start with the hybrid radish one. So the last 2 years we've tried growing fully biological radish, so no fungicides or insecticides on them. They did have herbicides in the early part to maintain weeds, but once we got to the fungicide program, we split the paddock and did half conventional and half biological system. In the last season, in the 2019 year, we ended up with that crop yielding exactly the same as the conventional, and so was the quality of the crop as well. So we took seed samples and checked on germ and vigour, and the quality was exactly the same. The big challenges we have within those radish crops from a disease perspective is white blister rust. And the other one which we've struggled with this year has been, well, the last 2 years, is alternaria. So the biological system we did, our general crop system had about a 3 spray program. So we replicated that, the timings of that, but instead of using commercial synthetic fungicides, we simply used biologicals, a mixture of 3 different biologicals, along with fish as well. And those timings were exactly the same as the conventional ones. So that was 3 applications on that crop last year, and they were about a 3-week timing between them. This year, I made a decision that, having talked to some of the biological people, that more often and smaller amounts is probably more beneficial. So this year we did 4 applications and reduced the active ingredient of the biologicals by the equivalent amount. And this year the result was that the biological was about 20% down on the conventional. I don't think it worked as well, not having quite those robust rates of biologicals on there, although in theory it should. But when you look at the net returns, that 20%, what I saved on the cost, there's actually very little difference on net return with the biological. We'll do some tests on the seed quality that came out of the radish this year. So I guess each year is different. One problem we had last year and also this year was the alternaria. And this year it actually came in as a secondary infection from the white blister rust. So what we did, we ended up putting a single fungicide across the rest of the paddock and left a control block. So even that one conventional spray with the other 3 biologicals is still not a bad option. You can put that conventional one on towards the end when you know that you've got the best out of the biological system, and that crop is still going to go well over target. So I guess, you know, you've got to be careful that you don't shoot yourself in the foot sometimes and say, this is how I'm going to do it, and lose a little bit of the crop. Sometimes you might have to take a bit of a sacrifice and a bit of hit on the biology. But if you're doing it towards the end of the crop, then there's not much more that biology is going to deliver to that crop. I guess the downside of that is that your following crop will have to take that hit that you have put those conventional chemistries on. But yeah, it's significantly cheaper. Those fungicides out of the system nearly halves the cost of growing a radish. And so, as I said, 20% drop in yield when you're nearly halving the cost of growing the crop. The net return looks pretty good. So we'll continue to do that program again next year in our radish. We'll do it again and see how it goes. But I guess the one thing I'll be looking for this year is, can we get on top of that alternaria with some biological treatments in some shape or form. So that was the radish this year, and I guess next year will be the 3rd year, and I think probably 3 years of data is quite good. Each season can be quite different, so and the disease pressures in each season can be different as well. So the next crop,
just before you jump, the next crop, what were the biologicals you were using, Dave?
Yeah, so we had 3 in there. We had some trichoderma, we had some BSAP, and some streptomyces as well.
Yep.
So, and obviously also some fish as a carrier in there. Generally, I think the rate was probably about 10 litres of fish with each of those times. So the crop got a reasonable amount of fish on it during the season as well. And we also put a bit of fish on quite early on, so that we probably when the plant was at about 4 true leaves, and that was getting some fish into the soil as well as onto the plant. I wanted to try and get some of that biology in the soil stimulated as well with the fish.
And you were using trichoderma at planting as well, weren't you, as a seed coating?
Yes, this year the crops had, both paddocks had trichoderma on as a seed treatment, and they're probably some of the best establishments I've had with radish. It jumped out of the ground and got away to a fantastic start. So yeah, I put a lot of that down to the trichoderma. The trichoderma, that was Tricho Start we used, and we were using a Sentinel for the one in the crop, which is quite a bare trichoderma, but it does seem to work well, and it works well on our broad beans as well for chocolate spot, botrytis type diseases. But even so, given that it's a dearer product, it's still relatively cheap compared to some of the commercial fungicide pricings that we get asked to put on at times. The other thing we're going to look at next year with the radish is some strip till, because we're growing the plants in half-metre rows. Currently, we're actually cultivating that whole strip, and really there's no need. So we'll play around with some strip till next year. And there was a little bit of data that came out of this year. One of the companies was doing some work, and they were looking at pseudomonias on the young plants, and just about, I think it was 20 crops they looked at, and they all had quite high levels of pseudomonia, except for the one crop which had been strip tilled, and it had about half the level of pseudomonia. So I presume that's coming from inoculum in the soil. So the less soil we can disturb, the less inoculum we're having to deal with, particularly at the young, when those plants are young.
I also wonder if that may have the strip till might have a beneficial effect on the alternaria as well. Yeah, I wonder if, it'd be interesting to see going forward.
Yeah, it could easily do. So I guess time will tell. We'll have a crack next year and do some more testing and see if, and I think any soil-borne disease, if you're not disturbing the soil, or certainly as much soil, you're not exposing the same levels of inoculum to the plant, and so it could have a wide range of benefits going forward. So yes, that's one.
It's interesting, Dave, because alternaria is one disease we haven't seen it in the radish, in the biological radish at all. So yeah, I do wonder whether the cultivation is a contributing factor to that, large contributing factor.
Yep, I think you're probably right.
And the other thing is an interesting point you made about the costing less, but the margins are still similar. I've heard from the merchants that the companies, the overseas companies who want the radish only want a certain amount, and people are massively overproducing. So there's only one thing that's going to mean, either less area or lower price going forward. So if we can produce a little bit less and get the same margins, that's got to be better for the future, doesn't it?
Yeah. Some of the pricing systems they have on contracts, that extra production, we're simply giving it away, and you're right. You're probably better off not to be producing it at a certain level. So yeah, the strip till I'm quite interested in. There's a number of people looking at strip till at the moment, so I think that'll be a good space for everyone to be thinking about going forward, and it'll be interesting to see some of the results come through from the strip till work in the next season. The next crop I want to just talk about, we had some wheat which we grew biologically. We decided we'll see how we can go. Feed wheat is what we normally grow. Autumn sown, we normally plant in sort of April time. So we decided we'd put a cover crop in prior to this. So the paddock was broad beans for seed. They are harvested about beginning of January, and there's a number of broad beans which fall on the ground after harvest. So what we did, we disked that paddock to bury the broad beans, and then we drilled in a cover crop of oats, phacelia, and buckwheat. And we know from testing that we've done over the years of soil in, we know that from the seed crop of broad beans and from the summer crop of broad beans and that cover crop, we're ending up with about 200 units of nitrogen in our soil, which is quite a lot. And I actually think a lot of that is coming from the summer cover crop. The nodulation during the summer when soil temperatures are warmer is obviously going to be greater. And I think at least half of that nitrogen is probably coming from the summer cover crop of broad beans, compared to maybe the actual seed crop, which is certainly in the ground a lot longer, but obviously was over in the ground during the winter period, which is a lot cooler. So that crop was planted in January and then terminated before we drilled the wheat. I ended up terminating about 2 weeks earlier because we had some of the cover crop starting to go to seed. I didn't want the oat seeds to become viable and then become an issue in the wheat crop. So we did terminate probably 2 weeks earlier, which would have been about 3 to 4 weeks prior to drilling. I always, as Simon mentioned earlier, I always try to aim for that 3 week period for planting. And what we did, we actually disked that crop in, so we grazed it with lambs. They removed probably 50% of the dry matter, and the other 50% of the dry matter was disked in. It was then planted in wheat, and we had no base fertiliser on the paddock, none at all. And then when it came to a fungicide program, we decided we would use, and we would replicate what we'd normally do in a conventional system. So we had a 4-spray program, a T0 to a T3 type program, but using biologicals. And the biologicals we used were the same as what we used on the radish, so some trichoderma, some B-sub, some ST, and some fish as well. The variety we put in was Firelight, which is a very resistant variety. We also did some strip trials with 2 other varieties. We used some Spider, which is a UK variety, which is middle of the range from a resistance point of view. And we also put in some Oakley, which is an old variety which we know gets disease. So they were all in the paddock, and we did strip trials come harvest time to get yields off them as well. We also put a control in the paddock which had no biological at all and no fungicide. And from a nitrogen point of view, we know that when we planted we had about 200 units of N in our soil. I know from experience on our soil type and our farm, I can bank on around about 100 units of N mineralising during the season. So that gives us 300 units of N, which is about 12 tonne crop. And we were aiming for a 15 tonne, so it should have got about another 70 units of N. At one stage it looked a bit light, and I went and put an extra 25 on. And I should have trusted my own calculations, because that extra 25 did cause a little bit of lodging in a couple of places. So in our system, I work on a mass budget for my nitrogen. I think it's still one of a reasonably accurate way of doing it. It's certainly better, a lot easier and better than some of the models that are out there. And so far it's been really, really accurate. So that crop ended up getting 100 units of N in total on it. And as I said, it probably only needed about 70. It had one herbicide at planting of Firebird, and it didn't have any more herbicides after that, except for a wild oat control. But as far as broadleaf weeds, there was enough cover there from the residue that had gone in the ground, and the crop quickly smothered any weeds that were coming. The crop looked fantastic all the way through. The Firelight, when we came to harvest time, the strip up the paddock with the Firelight yielded about 14.2 tonne. The Spider yielded about 12.5, and the Oakley yielded about 11.5, which is basically what you'd expect from the varieties and resistance abilities of each of those varieties to disease. The Firelight didn't get any sectoria at all, really. The Spider got a little bit of sectoria, and the Oakley got a lot of sectoria. but they didn't get any rust. So the biologicals did a reasonably good job on the rust, but the septoria was a different story. Septoria is always a challenging disease, and the biologicals didn't really have any great impact on them. The control block and the firelight, which had no fungicides, no biologicals, looked fantastic as well. So I guess the take-home message from that paddock is if you want to grow Regenda wheat or spray-free wheat, using the best genetics out there with resistance is probably a really good starting point. You know, you're always going to struggle if you're going to use a variety which is old or starting to break down in its resistance to a lot of those diseases. The other thing we noticed over the last 2 years is the sowing date and the level of septoria that we get by planting early. So we know that planting early gives us a yield increase, but it also often locks you into a spray program that's going to be pretty robust. And I've found that even 2 weeks delaying of planting makes quite a big difference to the type of spray program you have to use. So, yeah, we'll be delaying some of our planting a couple of weeks this year, and I think that will take at least one spray out of our program on the conventional side of things. The biological paddocks this year will do the same. They'll be planted in the next week or so, and yeah, I think hopefully we'll be able to get away without any fungicides on them at all. The crop also had no insecticides on, and we never saw any yellow dwarf virus in the crop at all. So yeah, I think there's ways of doing it. You might have to make some adjustments to planting dates and varieties, but you know, the ability to utilise cover crops to, 1, prime your soil, 2, to deliver some nitrogen, and you know, quite considerable amounts of nitrogen. So that summer cover crop of broad beans was only in the ground for about 6 to 7 weeks, and yet it's given us around about 100 kgs of nitrogen in our system. So it's a pretty good return for a cover crop to deliver that amount of nitrogen in such a short period of time. Residues was the other thing. I was just going to talk about wheat residues. We've done some work of trying to get as much residues into the ground as we can over the years. I've come to the conclusion that you're actually better off to have a better growing cover crop and sacrifice a little bit of the residue than trying to jam as much residue in the ground as possible. So we've sort of come to the point where we actually do bail off a little bit of excess now, and that means that we can get a cover crop established quicker and a better cover crop. We know that the roots of a cover crop will build soil carbon about 5 times quicker than what we can by putting residues in. So it makes sense to have a better cover crop growing and a better cover crop established than trying to battle away, trying to put huge amounts of residues back in the ground. And we did some drill trials this year here with the weaving and the John Deere, and to be fair on both the drills, it was simply a huge mat of straw we were trying to drill through. And when you get these big residue levels, it's almost unrealistic to try and drill through them or even get cover crops established through them. So I guess that's one thing I've accepted in the last couple of years, is that sometimes we have to, you know, bail off a bit of excess, and but that means we get a far better established cover crop, and I think that's been hugely more beneficial than having a half strip cover crop not delivering.
With your wheat straw, Dave, what sort of volume do you think you'd be getting? You know, would you be getting 10 tonne of straw on the ground?
They always used to say that it was 50-50.
Okay.
So, but that's with a 10 tonne crop. Yep. So when you get up, there is the ratio of grain actually increases to the stove. So a 15 tonne crop, I have seen the figures, and it's more like 37% straw, and the other, 63% grain.
Yeah.
So, but it's a huge amount of residue we're trying to deal with. And
so you might be baling off 5 tonne and keeping 5 tonne.
Yeah, at least there'll be there's probably 12 tonne there, and I'd say we'll bale off about 5 tonne.
Yeah.
But you've got to remember, you've still got all those roots there as well as the straw, and we do harvest quite high still, so there's still quite an amount there, and it's more than enough to start keep feeding the soil and deliver some benefits.
And I suppose with your experience on your block, you're actually, you're not going backwards, so it must be working.
No, we've been in a program with Plant and Food. Every 7 years, they come back to the same GPS site and do a big range of soil quality tests. And it was due to be done this year, but the coronavirus has put all that on hold. So I was really looking forward to those results. But over the last 2 rounds of testing, we're still seeing increasing in our soil carbon, and that's with cultivation in the system. So and I think with the cover crops in the system now, I think we'll probably see hopefully even a bigger jump in the amount of carbon we've got in our soil. But yeah, it's nice to know that we're a full cropping system and are increasing carbon.
No, sounds like you're doing a brilliant job there.
We talked one thing about the cover crop is what I quite like about it is it's another opportunity in our system to remove weeds. I quite like going into my cover crop and seeing a whole pile of weeds growing, because I know that I'm taking them out of the system. I know I'm going to terminate that crop, and it's another opportunity to remove the weed bank in our soil. And we've seen quite a reduction in the amount of weed that we've been dealing with in the last 15 years. A change in the variety of weeds, obviously, as we've got our soils better, but a reduction in the amount of weed as well. So, and I'm putting a lot of that down to the ability of the cover crops to germinate those weeds and an opportunity to terminate them prior to the next crop going in.
On the weeds thing, Dave, I think you'll probably find that the change in soil biology is having an effect on what plants prevail as well. And in terms of improving soil health, you'll get less persistence of those primary colonising weeds, like yeweed, etc., because the soil conditions aren't conducive to them dominating. On the residue thing, it's interesting because we've grown big crops here in the past, and a lot of people and all the overseas stuff seems to talk about leaving your stubble tall and drilling straight into that. Whereas since the mid-90s, I've always double mulched chopped through the header and double mulched after harvest, so that the residue, the actual stalk sticking out of the ground, is about probably 40-50 mil long, and all of the material that's come out the back of the header is chopped quite finely. And then going through with a tine drill clears a furrow, essentially, so you've got very heavy loads of residue between the sow rows and very little on top of the actual sow row itself. And that, because that residue that's on top of the soil won't break down if it's not in contact with the soil. So if it's sticking up in the air, it's not going to break down. And so you want that mat on the ground, in my view. But also it won't rob you of any nitrogen, because it won't actually start to decay until the wetter months of winter anyway. So if you're being robbed of nutrients, it's because of the decaying root mass under the ground. And I find that we get really good establishments of cover crops in that scenario, because it allows generally the soil surface is dry when you harvest, and if you do get any rains after harvest, all of that moisture is stored in the top part of the soil, ready for you to feed your cover crop. And having the thick layer or thick blanket on the ground protects you from the heat and the cold, and also holds that moisture in there at the time of the year when you most need it. So I probably have a slightly different view on it, and I manage it differently. But you're right in terms of soil carbon. from what I've observed, that the cover crop, the growing root in the cover crop definitely contributes miles more than the residue left on the surface. Doesn't actually contribute much to soil carbon, I don't think, because most of it is digested by the soil organisms and fed straight back to the plants, and a lot of it probably goes back into the air as carbon dioxide. So I think it's respired away. So it's captured and released in one season, mostly the soil residue. So you're right, the underground stuff is the key as far as building soil carbon.
Yeah, there's some work done in Australia on stubble heights and the shading effect of the stubble, and it was quite significant. Right through to harvest time, it had an effect on harvest yields. Obviously, Australia drilling in wide rows and planting in between rows, and the shorter stubble certainly gave the highest yields, and it was largely down to that shading. The other thing, Simon, as you say, I think that the mulching and the fine mulching is probably a key point, in that when you've got very short straws that you're dealing with, it can go around a leg at a time without wrapping, and because it's so short. Whereas we're trying to put a disc drill through, and when you've got longer straw, that's when you really do get that hair thinning. But I think you're right, by that fine chopping, double mulching, you've got it nice and fine so that your tine leg can go through and just make that nice wee groove, and the material can flow around it quite nicely.
Did I hear that the key to digesting soil residue is it needs to be close enough to the soil for a worm to jump over it?
Well, soil contact, isn't it, at the end of the day? The microbes have to be in contact with that residue, and I guess that's why some of ours is incorporated, and that certainly speeds the process up quite significantly. And then we throw a bit of fish over it as well. Once we've got some plants up, some fish on there, which also helps to speed up the process a little bit as well.
Do you add a bit of molasses to that, or just fish on its own?
Just fish on its own at the moment, but I do think the molasses and sugar would certainly help feed it a bit better.
Yeah.
The molasses would be a good idea.
So is it fair to say from that conversation that the main data you're producing, that you're placing on the residues and that kind of stuff, is more about the soil cover benefits as opposed to any kind of breakdown process feeding the crop?
I think for me it's I don't want all that stubble to digest at once, so I don't add anything to it, and it breaks down. It's all gone by the end of the winter, but it provides a place for stock to lie that's warm and dry through the winter after the cover's been grazed off, and it's not going to release those. You don't really need to release those nutrients from the material that's on top of the ground until you want them in the spring, I don't think. And as to how that actually takes place, I don't have enough information on that. An interesting comment, Dave, about shallow incorporation, because I think what we do, there's very little difference between what I do and shallow incorporation, because the point is you've got to get that close soil contact with the residue to get it to break down. And I guess shallow incorporation will probably just accelerate the process, whereas leaving it on top, the material decays from the bottom up, and soil organisms, there's just millions of things running around in there, shifting stuff around, chewing on it, eating things that eating the fungi that eat the straw, and the worms will move up into that layer. So yeah, it's just an interesting point that those two things are quite closely related. It just requires one less mechanical. Well, no, it actually requires the same number of mechanical passes. I'm just doing it with a mulcher, whereas you're doing it with a set of discs, maybe.
Yeah, and it's just a single pass, one pass. That's all we do. It can be quite rough actually, and you just leave it over winter. And this year we've drilled cover crops into them. So single pass is we've done, and then drilled into, and then we've also done another paddock where we've just left the stubble standing and drilled the same cover crop mix into it. So it'll be interesting come spring just which paddock, soil conditions look slightly better or not, the incorporated one or the one left standing.
think the thing that twigged me to it, Dave, was back in the day I used to do the standing stubble thing, and where the header had been and where the trucks had been in the paddock, there was a lot better establishment than where it was left standing, and so that was why I sort of I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Trial by default.
Yeah. And so I thought, I tried it with the roller for a start, thought it was at the rolling effect, but then the straw wouldn't lie down the same as it had under a heavy truck foot. So, no, it was definitely just getting that stuff onto the ground.
Yeah.
Sweet.
So, yeah, we're just here in cover crop paddock that we put in this summer. It was X-Broad beans. We talked about it before in the webinar. Planted in mid-January, 40 kgs of oats, the broad beans which were on the ground already from the seed crop of broad beans, 15 kg of buckwheat, and a handful of foliar as well. It's been terminated and grazed. We've probably grazed it more harder than I would have liked, and that's simply due to the fact that the works are pretty tight on space at the moment, and we're going to have to hold on to lambs a bit longer. So previously I would have probably left a little bit more cover on the ground, but we needed to feed this year. So you can probably see there how much residue is left, and there's still a reasonable amount there. So the question is now, what's the best way for me to put these oats, this wheat into the ground? So we're going to put a trial in here. We're going to simply direct drill straight into it in one trial. The next trial we'll subsoil and roll it, and then just drill into it. And the third one we will just incorporate the residue, subsoil and roll it, and then drill. Just to see if there's a variation in the yield at the end of the day with those three techniques of getting that wheat into the ground. We've done trial work in the past, and in the past, subsoiling has benefited us about 0.4 of a tonne on a heavy ground. On our loamier ground, there was no gains. I do wonder now, though, with the cover crops growing, whether those cover crops are doing some of that work for us. So this trial will be quite interesting, whether the unsubsoiled does actually yield less, or we may find that the cover crop is actually doing the subsoiling job for us in this situation. So we talked about residues during the webinar, and this paddock here, we've got a couple of things happening. We tried to direct drill straight into full residue, and then also into full residue incorporated. The full residue was probably, I'd say, unsuccessful. Simply the amount of residue we're trying to get through was simply too high. So the rest of the paddock we removed the excess by baling it off, and then incorporated the straw and then drilled into that. And I'll just turn the camera around and you can see the difference. So the first bit here is where we incorporated, baled the straw off and incorporated. And we've got a pretty good establishment there of the cover crop. There's some buckwheat in there, and there was some foliar, but the foliar germ was no good on this line, so it had to come up. And then if we just come across here, you can see the establishment where we had full residues, and certainly the establishment wasn't as good. But we were asking a lot of folk drills to get that seed in through the amount of residue in the ground here. And then we'll just move across here again. We did have a patch where we have incorporated the full residues and then drilled in. And we have got a better result, but it's still not as good a result as where we removed that excess residues. So yeah, it'll be interesting come spring when we look at this paddock and see if there's any variation into the different techniques we've used as to dealing with the residues.
The only thing I haven't talked about slugs. Is the only thing. Just on the whole slug debate, I do find that the paddocks that we've grazed and put stock across, the sheep's feet are still a pretty good tool as far as taking out a fair number of those slugs. I think that's one of the other benefits of grazing one of our cover crops is that we are removing a bit of nutrient within the stock, but hopefully we're getting paid for that.
Yeah.
But those stock, they do seem to knock the plant around, stand on a fair number of slugs that are there, and I do think that's helped us. We generally don't have a great issue with slugs. Normally when we're trying to grow just into monoculture crops like clover, in the multi-species crops, I don't really see any slugs at all, to be honest. Whether that's to do with the diversity or not, I'm not too sure, but it seems to be when we go into the monoculture crops, that's when we start to see the slugs. There's more of a challenge.
I was talking to James Halford the other day, and he said being dry land, he doesn't get much slug damage at all. But he said he watches his neighbours with irrigation, and they're all covering place in slug bait. I said to him, perhaps they're pumping them out of the ground.
I couldn't resist leaving Nigel's last little joke in there. Well, what we were kind of hoping that this post-harvest debrief session might motivate a whole flurry of trials from various members that we might decide to coordinate and that kind of stuff. So looking back on that session there, it's you got plenty of trials on trials, Dave.
Yeah, I'm probably better at trials than I am as a cameraman by looks.
Yeah, well, you've got mine. Oh, yep.
One thing on the trial, we talked about there setting up that trial in the cover crop. And when I went and set that trial up, I took the subsoiler out to the paddock. And the plan was to subsoil the whole paddock and do the trials in it. And I got to the paddock and I didn't subsoil it because I felt that it didn't need to be done. I felt that the cover crop had actually freed up that soil pretty well on its own right. So we've set the trial up, but the bulk of the paddock, which would have got subsoiled, we didn't do. And I'll put that down to the cover crop, but we've got the trial there, so hopefully we'll have some data coming out of it at harvest time to tell us whether it has done the equivalent job of the subsoil or not. So, really looking forward to that, those results.
Yeah, awesome. And it'd be pretty cool. I think it'd be pretty cool to look at ways of, I don't know, do you catalogue and record all of this kind of stuff in a format that other people can understand, or? Yeah,
all the data's logged in the yield mapping and all. It's just a matter of grabbing it out and then putting it into a presentable format, really.
Yeah. Cool. I reckon that'd be awesome. While the questions keep coming in, is there anything that came through there that you're answering in written form that you want to touch base on a bit more?
There's one there Mike said about, we're talking about the grain stover ratios. My understanding, Mike, was that the roots is actually additional to that. So that's another component below ground, which we know is significant. My understanding was that those figures of stover and grain were all above ground. So a 10-tonne crop was 50% grain and 50% stover above ground. And then the roots was additional biomass below ground on top of that again, was always my understanding of it. But, and there's a question there from Roger about the break feeding. Generally, I don't like break feeding. I do sometimes when we get a little bit tighter, but we certainly don't break feed, in small blocks. If we do break feed, generally we might cut the paddock into quarters or fifths or something and do it in larger blocks, simply for that compaction point of view. I'd rather have a great area in cover crops and crop and more free range graze it, because I'm quite happy for them to trample a bit in the ground anyway. At the end of the day, I don't want the cover crop to be bed off down to the dirt
and have no cover left on it. And generally when you break feed on those small blocks, that's what you end up with. So, you know, I'm quite happy to sacrifice a reasonable percentage of that cover crop just to lay it on the ground and do its thing.
Unless you want to be shifting twice a day, like some of us grazing addicted people. We actually, I cut out the conversation because it was a bit patchy that we recorded, but we're talking about the belly of high density cover crop grazing, and you were talking about some trial results about disease pressure following crops that have been grazed and ones that hadn't.
Yeah, we, as part of the 2020 work, we did quite a bit of work on grazing and looking at grazing as an option. And it is a really good option in high disease years. The problem is you've got to graze that crop before it starts going into stem elongation and the growing point comes up. And the problem is you don't really know what the rest of the season is going to be like at that point. If you had a crystal ball and you knew that it was going to be a really diseasey year, then grazing generally gave the highest yields. But in the dry years, when the crop got dry, the grazed ones were the lowest yielding. So you really need a crystal ball to know exactly what the rest of the season is going to be like. But yeah, that grazing, simply what it's doing is removing a whole lot of inoculum, and yeah, it can be an exceptional tool. But it's yeah, you've got to. It all depends on what the next season, the rest of the season is going to be like. But I guess if you've got irrigation, then it's a good option.
Nigel's thrown in a question there. What species are in your cover mixes, and do you have different mixes for different following crops or following different crops?
Because we're largely seed production, that's one of the biggest challenges I think I face is what can I put in there which doesn't contaminate my ground for the other crops we grow. So I don't put any grasses or clovers in because two important crops in our system. We don't want to contaminate the ground. So it does limit us to the number of species that we can put in. And we've already got a lot of legumes in our system. I'm quite conscious of that, and obviously not wanting to carry disease over with having too many legumes in the system. So at the moment, you know, the go-to ones for us is things like oats, phacelia, buckwheat. They're the ones which I know that I can control easily in our crops, and they're not going to be a problem to control from removing them wise. I'm sure there's others which we could, because at the end of the day, none of these we're going to let them seed, so there shouldn't be any seed dropping onto the ground for us. It's probably different than a cover crop in a grazing situation where you're quite happy to let it seed. But for us, you know, we really probably want to terminate these crops before they get to the point where they are going to have viable seeds. And at the end of the day, once a crop goes to seed, the roots have really done all they're going to do, but it's gone reproductive. And the root development largely stops on an annual once it's gone to seed. So, you know, for me, it's growing those roots, and once it's gone to seed, then to me, it's done its job for me. But yeah, getting enough species in my mixes is a challenge.
Roger's got a question. Termination timing before sowing. Have you seen any issues of terminating and direct drilling within a fortnight?
Up until now, I've aimed for that 3-week period, but today I've just been drilling a couple of paddocks. One was ex-Radish, which had a full strike of radish, a fair bit of radish struck, and it was simply dissed and drilled within the day. So green manure essentially dissed in. And the same with the next paddock we did today was peas. It was a paddock for breeding peas program, and the paddock was about probably 4 to 5 inches high with peas. And then once again, that was just dissed in and drilled the next day. So it'll be really interesting to see if we do get any effects from putting that green crop in the ground. But there's pretty good moisture in the ground at the moment, so for us, so it's certainly not going to be the first, the first moisture they're going to get is going to come from the ground rather than that that crop. The other thing is they weren't terminated, so there was no glyphosate or anything put on them. They were just straight in.
Yep. There's a couple more questions that have come up. Where are we?
I was wondering around the grazing time for the sowing. Generally that work was done on earlier sowings. But if you get all depends on the season. Sometimes you get through, you've had a mild winter and the crops are looking too advanced. But generally that work was done on early sowing, so probably March, early April type sowing crops.
Yeah, and I remember we had a conversation with Simon about the sort of historical traditional grazing of winter wheat crops and why that potentially went away, probably being due to its impact on yield.
I think it's understanding where the growing point is in the plant. If you graze too late and you graze off that growing point of that stem, then that's it. It's not going to come back. So you could very easily graze it too late and remove a lot of yield. So timing's pretty crucial.
Yeah. Nigel's got another question. Do you know if the processed beans that are grown supply a similar amount of nitrogen as your broad bean crops?
You don't see the nodulation on the processed beans as much. I don't know what it is about the broad beans or favour beans. They do seem to nodulate a lot more. I don't think it does. The broad bean one, the figures there, we actually did a trial one year. It was the same trial. We'd done broad beans to seed, then a summer crop of broad beans, and the following crop of wheat, half the paddock we didn't put any nitrogen on it. So we knew there's should have been 300 units in the ground there, and so we didn't put any nitrogen on half the paddock, and that half the paddock went exactly 12 tonne. So the budget that we'd worked out was right, and 12 tonne of wheat should use up about 300 units of N. I have been thinking during the day though that not all of that nitrogen is nodulating necessarily out of the bean. So obviously the soil's mineralising during the period of that cover crop as well. And James had a question earlier on about testing the soil before the cover crop goes in for N and afterwards. And you can do that, but obviously during that period of time, and obviously soil mineralises at a faster rate when its temperatures are higher. So you'd have to add in a component of soil mineralising during that time. And as I said earlier, we bank on about 100 kgs coming through our system and from an autumn crop through to harvest. So that's going to vary when that's delivered, but obviously a lot of it's delivered as the soil warms up and the soil can mineralise at a faster rate.
Okay, James Halford had a question. Have you tried establishing cover crops into ryegrass stubble, and if so, how successful was it?
No, not really. We ran a drill across a ryegrass paddock this year with a mix in it, but we were short of feed, so they ate it all off, the lambs. But you do wonder though. We've got a monoculture of ryegrass sitting there, and I'm sure having some diversity in it would be beneficial for the soil. So I do think it's a good option, and I haven't tried it, but I'm sure it would work here. You'd have to get something that's going to compete with the ryegrass growing, because some of these ryegrasses post-harvest are pretty aggressive in their regrowth.
Yeah, this is probably an ignorant question from me, but do you usually run those ryegrass seed crops for a two harvest year? Is that why they?
No, generally they're a single year crop. We are growing some 2 years this year, but generally they're a 2 year crop, but we take them through the winter. So we're trying to keep that ryegrass in the ground as long as we possibly can. So generally we go direct drilled into peas post the ryegrass. So it's in the ground for about 18 months and then direct drilled. That's, at the end of the day, that's one of our restorative phases, ryegrass, but maybe some of these cover crops are just as beneficial at building roots as well.
Right, looks like our stream of questions are starting to dry up. If anyone wants to, we'll probably try and finish by 9:10 at the latest. But if anyone else wanted to jump in here and particularly around some of the key things, James, again, here we go. I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I can't type fast enough, but I have established cover crop into terminated turf ryegrass seed, and it is very slow to get established, and also got an awful lot of germination of the seed that's come out the back of the header as well, so that's a bit of an issue. And also, you need to get in early with these cover crops to get them away well. 2 weeks late or a week late in drilling it makes a huge difference on how advanced it is. Finished.
James, do you think it would be successful if you hadn't terminated? You just went straight in to the grass?
God. Depends. It depends on moisture, I suppose. Depends on if there's. We were late terminating it because it was so dry that we hadn't got any regrowth of the parent plant. So I was hanging off to get enough regreening to terminate the grass. So I probably lost several weeks anyway. I don't know about drilling straight into it. No, it's a difficult one. What do you think?
Yeah, it'd be pretty, it'd be tough competing with the ryegrass. But depends what you put in. Something like oats can get up and above the grass. Potentially could work. Buckwheat. Obviously some of the clovers and things would get, if you tried, would get smothered and sheltered pretty quickly. But I think you'd want to be in there, as you say, pretty much the day after harvest, and while the plant's just recovering, and get that cover crop in and up.
I think you're probably right. I mean, we put oats and rye corn and brassicas in there. I don't know. It just seems to be being held back.
There's another question here from Simon Lockhead. How do you guys find the time to get the covers in post-harvest before your crop, particularly with a late harvest?
Yeah, I guess one question that raises is how long do you have to have a cover crop in the ground for it to be beneficial? How much time have you got? I guess at the moment we're aiming for the crops to come off nice and early, so the broad beans are off in early January. Processed peas, we generally follow with processed beans, but it is an opportunity that comes off in December and does give you a pretty big window to grow a cover crop during that summer period. It's just time's always a problem post-harvest. I reckon it's our busiest time of year. Autumn now, spring's actually not too bad. But and then sometimes I just get a contractor, and a lot of our cover crops now, I just get the contractor in, and he's drilled some of them for us. So that simply makes it pretty simple.
Yeah, I remember questioning Simon Osborne on that once, because he was drilling in a cover, and I think he was intending to come back and terminate and plant within about 6 weeks. And that kind of stuff, and obviously you're not getting a huge amount of biomass in that, but his opinion at that point in time was that 6 weeks of growth that you do get there was worth the time and cost of the seed, and getting that in there, which wasn't what I expected to hear.
Well, the first year we did one of the first years we did the beans, I think it was in the ground 6 weeks or 7 weeks, and the oats were coming out in ear, and the beans and oats were knee high in 6 weeks, 7 weeks. So, during that summer period, things do tick along pretty damn quickly. But we are saying planting in, so that's growth during February, March, which is obviously optimum. Once you start planting towards the end of March, those growth rates certainly do drop off. But I think if you've got a window of 6 weeks, that's more than enough to get something in and be beneficial.
Yeah. No, I just realised that there was a Sam Lang in the participants thinking it's because I sent Simon Osborne my direct link to this webinar, so he's actually on here. So I'll unmute you, Simon. I assume that's you. If you want to chip in there.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep. I'm honoured to have my name, mate.
I think with the cover crops, it depends on the season. Like this year, I haven't. I did about 50 hectares of fairly comprehensive covers into the wheat stubbles because there was moisture there. We got them mulched nice and early, and I had a window of opportunity in harvest, and we got them drilled, and they're about a foot high now. And I'm still drilling oats and tares now. I didn't do any of the Phacelia buckwheat and crimson clover pre-wheat this year because it was just so bloody dry, and the thought of going out and irrigating cover crops when there's just so much else to do, I just pulled the pin on it, and it stayed so dry that the soil's just been cracking open nicely, and we had a lot of lime to do, so that it just worked out quite well. And yeah, probably has a negative effect on the soil, but hey, I can only do what you can do. And I'm done.
Cool. Cheers, Simon. We might wrap up with the last question from Peter Legg. Here, can you comment on your fertiliser applications other than nitrogen? Are you able to reduce other nutrient inputs?
So this year, all of my wheat's been planted with no base fertiliser. The wheat trial last 2 years have been no base fertiliser. Previously, the only base fertiliser we were using was sulphur super, and I was really putting that on more for the sulphur rather than any phosphate. So this year we've pulled the pin on base fertilisers for the wheat, and we'll see what happens. The only thing I worry about having done that is I can put sulphate ammonia on in the spring to cover off the sulphur. There is a bit of calcium in the phosphate as well, but I do wonder whether I'm going to have to somehow compensate for that. But that simply might be a bit more lime, a bit more regularly. And as far as N, we've always been a low N input system. So I haven't really worried about looking at going to alternative types of N because we're reasonably low on our input. But yeah, I guess it's something that we'll look at some point. And this year, no, I haven't worked out this year's average N across the wheats. But one of a previous year, our average was 140, and we averaged 14 tonnes. So that's 100 to 1 response. Well, I guess you can't call it a response because it depends on what's in the ground, but it's a pretty good yield on a low input right across all the wheat. So, I think we'll just keep on aiming to keep reducing that and utilising the cover crops to be a tool to reduce the amount of N we have put in our system. Interesting enough, when we did the trial a couple of years ago where we put half the paddock with no N on, the other half of the paddock that did get some N got I think it was probably 100 units. So technically that should have yielded another 4 tonne, and it only yielded another 1.5 tonne. So the natural fertiliser in the ground, natural N in the ground, was obviously more effective than the applied N. And I don't think we would have lost that extra stuff, volatility wise. So yeah, I think there's certainly the N that you've got stored in your soil does work better or is more beneficial to the plant than the applied chemical N.
Yep. And just the last question off the back of that to wrap up. Do you have any kind of advice for arable farmers that are transitioning out of a more conventional system towards, I guess, roughly where you're trying to get to as well, in terms of things to watch out for, ways to go about it?
Yeah, I think you just pick a couple of paddocks and go with it. And I think there's some basic ones there. I think priming your paddock with a cover crop is quite important. Getting those right species in there, getting some buckwheat and some phacelia to get that phosphate brought up to the surface again, and some N in the system. If you can preload the paddock with N. Once again, this all depends on your soil type. We're lucky we've got a heavy soil type and we can store a lot of N without leaching it. Obviously, if you're on a lighter soil type, you're going to be limited to the amount of N that soil will store. Just have a crack, and use those genetic varieties that are more resistant, because it's a big advantage. I think we could get to a point where we could do just about spray-free wheat. At the moment, there's only an oat spray and a PGR, which is really going on once the plant's out of the ground. So, at the moment, we're not that far away from a spray-free situation, and it hasn't been that hard. But it is trial and error. You learn every year. You learn something new, and there'll be the odd failure along the way. But pick a couple of paddocks and have a crack at it, and then work out what system works for your farm, because every farm's different. What I do will be different than someone else, but you might be able to pick up some of the things I've learned that you can apply to your own system or your own farm.
Sure. I'll just actually that set of questions probably. I wonder whether so we've got 3 to 5 more post-harvest debriefs over the next 3 to 5 weeks that we're lining up at the moment. So we'll keep doing these every Thursday, 8 p.m. For a while. I wonder if at the end of it we get a bit of a panel together and we actually open it up so that farmers that are sort of new into the transition can actually prompt some questions, more like a panel Q&A at the end of it, once we've been through this kind of series. Might be quite a cool idea, just to get a bit more specific and technical for some farmers.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And the spray-free wheat actually gives me an opportunity to pitch a webinar we're going to run. Just locked it in for Monday night, 8 p.m. With Angela Clifford she runs Eat New Zealand and the food farm in Waipara there, and she's super keen to encourage the Quorum Sense general sort of regenerative farming community to think a lot more about local food systems and trying to get produce into our sort of local communities and that. And so she's got a pretty good overview of what's happening in the kind of local, national and global food system. And she's sort of done it herself in terms of direct marketing her own produce and that as well, and has pretty amazing networks in that. So if anyone on the call's interested in that just generally, or has been thinking about it and wants to get some advice or possible connections and stuff off Angela, I'll be sending out a link to that for Monday night as well. She's pretty awesome, so should be good fun. And on that note, 9:15. Thanks very much, Dave. That was bloody brilliant, mate. And yeah, thanks everyone for being in attendance. Thanks for firing those questions through. There was probably twice as many as last time. We'll catch you all next week.
Good. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.